Hey guys, this is SAAD. I've had many people with many titles on the show, a huge list of titles, but I've never had someone that I'm compelled to call the Honorable so and so. So
Ooh,
today we have the Honorable MP Michelle Rempel. Let me tell you who she is before I cede the floor to her. She is a federal member of the Canadian Parliament representing the riding of Calgary Nose Hill out of Alberta. She's a member of the Conservative Party. Oh boy, that means she probably is a Nazi. And then she is the official opposition critic for immigration, refugees, and citizenship. Welcome on the show, Michelle.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation. This is going to be so much fun.
It
I've been
is,
looking
and
forward
indeed.
to
Let's
talking.
do it. So I thought we'd start off first by talking about how you decided, when is it that the light went off in your head? This is what I want to do. I want to follow a political trajectory. Walk us through that process.
Well, first of all, a very simple answer, but there's some truth to it, is because I can. Like, Canada is this wonderful place where there aren't the same barriers to entry into the political system that, say, you would even see in the United States, where political financing is such a big issue. So, in Canada, our democratic system is set up such that anybody from any background really can get involved and make a difference. So I started, um, to be honest with you, what it inspired me to get in politics, and I don't think I've ever really divulged this before, was I had a Liberal member of Parliament come to my high school when I was 17 years old, and it was in a riding that had been held by the Liberals for about 30 years. And my family is very apolitical. And I just remember being so struck by the entitlement in his speech and how he presented himself that it actually motivated me to look into what the political system was. I started volunteering with one of the legacy parties of the Conservative Party of Canada. And I very quickly realized that one person can make a difference in Canada. So from there, I obviously was developing my professional career at the same time, but I spent a lot of time volunteering on campaigns. By the time I was 27 years old, I was co-chairing the Conservative Party's National Policy Committee. I had run several successful campaigns, and the rest was kind of history. I say this out of hopefully motivation for people who are watching your show to know that, regardless of political stripe, one of the great things about being Canadian, it's a privilege but also a responsibility, is that when you get involved in the political process, you can make a big difference. I don't come from a special background. I just worked really hard. And that opportunity is afforded to any Canadian. So that's my story. And also, the policy itself motivated me. I grew up in a time when I grew up in, and I saw the turnover in government when it went to NDP, and I saw some of the detrimental policies in effect on the economy there. And I also lived through, the sponsorship scandal and a lot of different things that were a big impact on my political career. So, you know, policy and ideas should motivate you to translate that into the political system. And that's my story in a nutshell.
Well, it's a great story because I often receive a lot of emails from people telling me, well, I'd love to get engaged in the battle of ideas. That's the ecosystem that I live in, whether it be fighting stupidity in the public arena or fighting stupidity on university campuses. That's ultimately what I do. And they always feel as though they're lacking in power, right? Because they always say,
Yeah.
well, you're a fancy professor and you've got the big following and so on, but what can I do? And then my answer is, we all have voices. Some of our voices are on, we use bigger megaphones, but we all have the ability in Canada to engage one another. You can do it via Facebook. You could do it at your
Yes.
local bar. And so here is you. You don't come from a sort of political dynasty family. You didn't have billions of dollars behind you. You decided you wanted to get engaged, and look where you are now in the political echelon.
And I love the comment that you made about social media, because it really is the great equalizer. Uh, Even in the past couple of years, I've watched, everyday Canadians just embrace these platforms and really push ideas. And I think that's really exciting. YouTube, Facebook, I mean, your phone is a platform. And that's something that we should be using and embracing to push ideas. And I think it's an exciting thing, as
You
long
know,
as it's not censored.
Right. You know, I see a lot of similarities between us, if I may, in that we both sort of exist in a ecosystem that's very politically correct, yet we are somewhat irreverent to a lot of the BS, right? And perhaps not surprisingly, that's why we both love the tools that are afforded to us via social media. Of course, I do the standard stuff. I publish in tops, peer-reviewed journals and all the rest of it. But I also think, my goodness, I've got all these tools which 10 years ago I couldn't have even imagined that I could have such a megaphone. And I could use these to spread ideas. Why isn't every professor doing it? So I'll turn the question to you. Why aren't more politicians doing exactly what you're doing and engaging the public? Is that they're afraid to utter a syllable out of place that might ruin their careers? Is it cowardice?
Well, I think that's such an interesting question. But I have to start by saying I come out of academic administration as well. I spent almost 10 years, in a senior role in two of Canada's top universities. And I always sort of joke when people ask me, like, you've done well in politics. Why is that? And I sometimes say, well, actually, entering Parliament is a less political environment than the one I came out of. But I mean, we could do a whole show just on academic politics. But to your point about why politicians maybe aren't embracing this medium, I think it's because the rules aren't set yet. And what I mean by that is I don't, in the past, perfection is something that I think a lot of voters or the media tried to, like, you had to sort of fit this certain mold as a politician to be all the boxes checked to be electable, right? And I think that sort of translated, and I even felt this when I first entered Parliament. I think it's changed. You're under a lot of pressure to have the perfect message and not go totally off message, or say the talking point exactly right and have consistency in message. Whereas what I've learned is that by taking some risks and you can translate the political message or the idea that is shared among caucus colleagues or a government, but you're making it personal and you're making it relevant to you. And in doing so, I think you're trying to make it relevant to your voters. But there's risk in doing that, right? Like there's a large risk. Like I've seen colleagues of all political stripe really fail on that. I failed in that regard, but I kind of just don't care at this point. Like, I know that's probably the message that like the upper echelon wants to hear, but I'm confident enough in my communication ability that I don't see that as a risk. I see this platform as something that is not just a nice to have in my job, but is probably a core vital component, because this is how people are engaged in the political process right now. I mean, I still have town halls in my riding. I still send out my paper newsletters because there are a segment of my electorate that wants information in that way. But there's a large majority of my electorate that wants it this way. So I think people are coming on board. I don't think it's cowardice. I think it's just lack of familiarity with the medium. Like, I mean, doing this, I mean, I know, like, I'm in a really shitty hotel room right now. Like a lot of my colleagues would be like, oh, I don't have the Canadian flag backdrop. And, oh my God, there might be a pillow in the background. Is that what I want to be framed up on? And it's at the end of the day, I think that the net gain in being able to talk to you and talk about politics it's a greater win than being worried about, the duvet in the background and that being the still shot, right? So I think it's coming. I don't think it's cowardice. I think it's a lack of familiarity with the gains that you can make. And I think that in the next, I wouldn't even say 5 years, I think the next election will be won or lost on this medium. And it's going to be publish or perish,
right?
If you will, on this.
Well, in a sense, I mean, what you're referring to is a measure of authenticity, right? Whether we like Donald Trump or not, he was authentic. He wasn't scripted. He wasn't Hillary cyborg Clinton, right? And so a lot of people said, wow, that's refreshing. He may say some idiotic off-the-cuff things once in a while, but he's genuine. He's authentic. And there is something to be said about this. And of course, not to imply that you've ever said anything like that, but just being authentic, being real, not being so scripted is a breath of fresh air, right?
Right. And maybe I'll temper my message by saying this. You need to be authentic, and you need to know your message. But I think that you also have to translate an element of statesmanship and translate an understanding of the gravity of the role when you're elected to parliament. I mean, I represent 120,000 people, and if you think about that, just even in the sheer size of, let's say, a hockey arena or something like that, it's a lot of people. I am their vote and I am their voice, and I think you have to carry that gravity with you. I haven't been perfect on that. It's been a learning experience for myself. But when I watch others fail or succeed, and I even look at myself, I think you have to be authentic, but still realize the weight of the role that you're performing, and make sure that comes across in your communications as well. Of course, bearing in mind that we all have moments of irreverence and going from there.
Right. So let's move on to what is your typical day like? I released a SAAD TRUTH clip a while ago where I sort of demystified what is it that a professor typically does. So yes, of course, I do research.
I love.
Right. And I received a lot of comments where people said, oh, gee, I didn't know that, so much of your time was spent away from teaching, because a lot of people have a sense that what a professor does is ultimately just teach to older kids. Instead of them being 7, they happen to be 25, whereas teaching is really a very, very small part of my daily routine.
Sure.
And so maybe you could walk us through what's a typical day in your professional life.
There is no typical day. Like, there's this great myth. I would say the one sort of common denominator on every day is that work is constant. Like, it doesn't go away ever. Especially with my office is my cell phone, right? For all intents and purposes. So it's not just my staff communicating with me or constituents communicating with me through my office or email or whatnot. It's also, responses coming in from social media, or requests for intervention, or, just noticing that, like last week when the Americans introduced steel tariffs, all of a sudden I had all of these, communications objectives that I wanted to put forward on the day. And it was like, okay, what are we communicating on this? Because this is so important. So I would say, high level, the one common denominator is it being constant. But there are sort of several spheres of work that a parliamentarian engages in. One is legislative work. So that's looking at the laws that are coming forward and laws that you can bring forward. Reviewing that and figuring out how you're going to represent your constituents in debates, in committee work, questioning the government, questioning the minister, putting political pressure on the government to change a policy direction, or if you're in government, putting that policy direction forward yourself. There's the political aspect of the job. I will be into a campaign cycle very shortly, and thinking about how I'm reaching my electorate from the perspective of organizing a team for the next election, fundraising, working for, doing volunteer work for other candidates. And then if you have a government position and you're in cabinet, you have the whole management responsibility of a federal department. You have your role in reviewing cabinet documentation. And all of these things. And then, of course, there's the last one that I always mention, but it's at the core of everything, is your constituency work. So dealing with constituents that have everything from immigration casework to problems with the CRA, or a government minister isn't listening to them. So all of these things overlap. Communications is a vital underpinning of all of that. And when you think about all of those balls in the air and how quick the news cycle is and how quickly issues arise, it's really heavy. I just, while I'm on your show, I couldn't do this. I often joke that I'm the, hood ornament on the car. The people that are are the staff that I work with. I work with some really brilliant, really strong people, and I have a huge team of volunteers that help me as well. So it's a team collaborative effort that just never really finishes.
Are there any parts of all of these different balls, as you said, that you're juggling, that you appreciate more than others? So here are the two things that I really am passionate about in terms of my job, and here are the two things that, I have to do, but I don't really like them so much.
I guess there's not a routine, right? And it really depends on the subject matter that you're dealing with. I mean, if I can give an example, the work that I did around the Yazidi genocide was very meaningful, but it was also very difficult. A lot of Canadians, blessedly, are not confronted with the reality of a genocide sitting right in front of them in the form of a 22-year-old woman who had escaped sexual slavery. Stories like that, they're actually quite common in people that are coming into my office, and that takes it takes something out of you, and you end up growing a thick skin with the criticism that comes in. Like, I'm not in this job to be liked. I'm in this job to affect change, and getting to that point of self-confidence is a good thing, but it takes something from you. So it's not really about like or not like. It's about, what am I doing today that is going to affect change, bearing in mind that I have the privilege of speaking on behalf of a lot of people, and they pay my salary. So I know that's not like a really sort of simple answer, but your question doesn't really beg a simple answer. But I would say, for anyone who's looking to enter the political realm, it's really worthwhile. And it's what you make of it. You see people who are very successful in terms of taking the role seriously and making a difference, like, saying, I did this, I can tell you what I have done. And then you see people who just sit back and see it as, an easy role.
Right.
But that's supposed to be evaluated by the electorate.
Right. Did you, not to have a sort of somewhat humorous, if not possibly tragic segue, because you spoke about genocide, I don't know if you had the chance to watch my testimony in front of the Canadian Senate last year. I went to Parliament Hill both to testify in front of the Canadian senators regarding Bill C-16, and then later that evening I gave a talk on Parliament Hill on the death of the West by 1,000 cuts. But during my testimony in front of the Canadian senators, when I was describing some of the potential pitfalls with some of the overreach of Bill C-16, where I was talking about the fact that as an evolutionary psychologist, I study sex differences. I recognize that humans are biological beings, that there is such a thing as male or female, something that the average 3-year-old knows. One of the senators concluded, after my very sober and reasoned testimony, he accused me of being pro-genocide. Were you aware of this or no?
No.
Okay, so this is Senator Joal, or luminary Senator Joal, who decided that my offering some sobering analysis of the possible overreach of the transgender bill C-16, was akin to me being pro-genocide, to which I responded that as someone who escaped execution in Lebanon and came to Canada because we're Jewish, I'm not sure that I should be lectured about genocide. And then he was taken aback by it. But it just sort of gives you a sense of the theater of the absurd. I mean, I just found some of the behaviors of the senators were so outlandish in terms of the theater that they were putting on. Do you have any comments about that?
I guess I would comment from the perspective of ask a question like, what is the role of a parliamentarian? What are we there to do, right? And when you talk about a committee, legislative committee, the role of a legislative committee is to bring in experts and really look at law or potential initiatives, and come out with a product that is in the best interest of the country. And when parliamentary committees function well, they bring in viewpoints from all different perspectives, and then as a parliamentarian, you kind of you try and synthesize that data and say, okay, is this something that I think translates into this? What does this mean? I guess what I'm trying to say is that questioning dogma is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it changes my mind, sometimes it doesn't. The importance of having a diversity of viewpoints in a parliamentary committee or in Parliament writ large is that when you question dogma and you critically think about something, I believe you have better public policy output. All political parties are guilty of this, but what I've seen, like, I mean, I haven't seen your testimony. I haven't seen this, but I've seen situations where people have come and given a viewpoint that maybe nobody on the committee agrees with. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be associated with some sort of a label. I think most people understand what the boundaries are of hate speech, right? I think most people understand what the boundaries are when it comes to language or propaganda that willingly incites violence. What I worry about right now is that if in Canada we're not more judicious about allowing for a diversity of viewpoints and understanding that critical thinking is not something that's an affront to society, it's actually a critical part of how we see progress, I'm worried. So, you know, I'm sorry you had to go through that without seeing it, but you know, I do worry. Yeah. And I think free speech is something that we probably need to have a harder and tougher conversation about in Canada, especially, you know, going back to the front of the conversation with this becoming our medium of discourse and big companies being able to determine who gets seen and who doesn't.
Right. We'll come back to some of these freedom of speech issues when we talk about motion M103 and so on. But I thought what we would now go to next is arguably, I think if we asked each of us, either of us, who is our all-time hero, I think it will be unequivocal that we would both say it's Justin Trudeau. And so I have my own reasons as to why I think he's a hero. And for anyone who doesn't know, I am being sarcastic, but maybe you can tell us, Michelle, what are some things that you appreciate about Justin Trudeau, and what are some things that you wish that he perhaps held a different position on?
To me, the core of the issue is, what is the role of a prime minister, right? The Prime Minister of Canada is a leader of a G7 country. There's a lot of people who depend on that person to provide direction on tough issues. I don't have to agree with someone to respect them.
Sure.
And I don't agree with most of what Justin Trudeau does. But what I'm concerned about with Trudeau is that, you know, and you asked me to give something that I appreciate. I think it's important for Canada to put a really good foot forward on the international stage. And I think, you know, his charisma in some quarters has, you know, sort of raised the profile of Canada's brand. But it's also, I think, diminished Canada's brand in some ways. Because you can't, public service is called public service for a reason, because you are serving the public. They are not serving you. And I really don't appreciate the lack of seriousness he's brought to the role, especially on the international stage of late. I mean, like, the India trip was just a debacle.
Right.
It was embarrassing. But it's not just that one instance. It's you know, it's the Aga Khan issue. It's his ministers with their expense scandals. It's, you know, all of Bill Morneau's issues. It's this entitlement complex that he has failed to address and just completely glossed over. And I mean, I sit in the House of Commons. They've put forward virtually, you know, no legislation that mattered. I mean, like, small example. Canada doesn't have a law on bestiality right now because of the Supreme Court case. It would take them like one small government bill to deal with this, and it's been like 2 years, and there's pending cases on that. Like I could give you a million examples. So that's my frustration. Moreover, with the Prime Minister, it's that I don't think he has a deep understanding of how much responsibility he has as the chief public servant. That's that person who's been entrusted to lead the country. And then that culture, right? Like that lack of seriousness translates down in his caucus.
Right.
Because when you're the leader, you set the tone for what's acceptable. And I mean, that's true of any political party, and no political party is perfect. But I think that's why India resonated for a lot of Canadians, regardless of political stripe, because it was just this capstone on 2 years of not taking the job seriously. And I mean, I'm happy to debate Justin Trudeau on any policy item. I am. I'm confident in that. I don't think he would debate me on everything, but that aside, um, I don't mind disagreeing with someone. I don't mind disagreeing on policy. But when you can't come to that point because somebody's not taking the job seriously and is just failing in the job, like just abject failure, uh, that's really concerning for the country. And every Canadian, regardless of if they're liberal, regardless if they're an ardent card-carrying, especially if you're an ardent card-carrying liberal, should be asking, who is this guy and what is he doing in dancing around India?
Right.
It's a problem.
You know, I warned anyone who was willing to listen about the dangers of this guy because I saw him coming a mile away. He represents, so this, for anyone who's watching, these are my opinions, so no transfer onto Michelle because I don't want her to be in any way tarred because of my positions. I think he represents everything that I have fought against for the past 20 plus years in academia. He is the perfect melange of all the pseudo BS that has been taught for 40 plus years in the humanities and in some of the social sciences in the universities. That's what I basically refer to as the death of the West by 1,000 cuts. So some of those 1,000 cuts are postmodernism. Who are we to know what is an objective truth? Cultural and moral relativism. Who are we to judge if female genital mutilation is barbaric or not? No, it's barbaric to say that it is barbaric, as Justin Trudeau taught us a few years ago. Radical feminism, gender quotas for the cabinet. So he is the social justice warrior par excellence. He is the king or queen. I don't want to imply that maybe he self-identifies as female. He represents that which some of us in academia, myself, Jordan Peterson, a few others, have been fighting. And that's what's so disheartening. So when you're talking about he's not serious, I think he's not serious because he has been parasitized by such dreadful ideas. I don't think he's a sinister guy. I don't know him. You certainly know him a lot better than I do. But I don't think he has any sort of diabolical intent. He's not a bad guy. He's not a sinister guy. He's just been parasitized, starting with his dad, with a set of ideas that are dreadful, that are contrary to individual rights. And that's why we end up with Justin Trudeau.
Can I give you a slightly alternative take without completely disagreeing with you?
Go for it.
I want to make 2 points. So first of all, isn't it interesting that rather than talking about the government in terms of whether or not policy is working or not, we're talking about Justin Trudeau. We're talking about a person. And I think that that's both his strength because his brand is so strong, people like him, and it's also his greatest weakness, as we saw with India. But overall, the fact that Canadians have to spend so much time talking about a person, I think it's like it's the Liberals' election strategy, but it also diminishes the translation of ideas. And to that point, I think you're giving him too much credit. I really do. I think you're making him seem like this evil mastermind that has this like deep, he could sit down and write a policy manifesto on how he wants to fundamentally transform Canada into, some sort of socialist vision. He does not have that depth. He really doesn't. I watch it in the House of Commons every day. Like he's flipping through his talking point binder. I mean, you see it all the time. When he screws up in the media, like, he made this comment with that children's science show host, about...
Oh, yes. And that's when I found out that my two young children...
If you're a baby, you're a scientist.
So I have two young scientists at home. I have two children. They're both scientists.
I mean, like, we're not talking about the scientific method. We're not talking about the training that goes... I mean, I guarantee you what happened there was that he was at some sort of dinner party and somebody... said some sort of a quote, from somebody that he heard, and he was like, "Oh, this is going into like my soundbite clip."
Right.
Same thing with when he came out and talked about the steel tariffs about 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you saw that disastrous clip where he's trying to. I'm not sure. I think he was trying to explain what a trade surplus was. And for me, I know what happened. Like some bureaucrats went in to try and brief him on this, and he was like, that gif of like the woman with all the mass symbols around her, like trying to internalize this, and then he couldn't repeat the line. What I am concerned about is I think Canadians do think that he is this is all by design. But as you saw with Bill Morneau with the budget, as you see with some of the bills that they're putting forward, what is happening is the civil service is running government. They don't have people that are familiar with how to work within a ministry. He's got weak cabinet ministers. I guarantee you that they're all bringing proposals to cabinet that are unfunded. And that is where the bureaucracy runs amok. Like Bill Morneau's small business tax changes, I guarantee you the bureaucracy has been sitting on that for 20 years, right? And finally they've got a sucker who's going to buy into that. And the bureaucracy, their goal, I mean, I've worked with great public servants, so I want to qualify that by saying there are a lot of really good, talented people who work in the public service, but then there are also people who have lost the understanding of what they're managing to, right? So they think that they're managing to keeping their job or something else, and that's where a minister and a prime minister's job is to go in and say, this is the political will of the people. This is the mandate I've been given, and you will implement it. I would like your advice. I will take your advice, but at the end of the day, it is my job to do this. And Justin Trudeau, no. Like, I cannot give him any credit for any sort of policy mastermindship on this. Justin Trudeau, I don't think could manage his way out of a wet sock.
No, but I actually agree. Sorry to interrupt you. Excuse me for interrupting you, but I actually agree with you. That's why I said I don't think he's diabolical. I don't think he's evil. I don't think he's sinister. I don't think it's a plot. I think in his intellectual, quote, intellectual training, he has been parasitized by really bad ideas. So when we do talk colloquially about the social justice warrior, about identity politics, he represents that, right? So that's why I'm saying he's a hapless guy. He's not diabolical. But then,
well, I would say it's like the ability. Does he have the ability to critically think? Like, does he have the ability to say, okay, this I've had 5 special interest groups in the office saying the exact same thing. Should I bring in an alternative view, right?
He doesn't have that ability.
I don't think he has that ability, or anyone around him that's willing to do that, right?
And I would say, I mean, think of it this way. Any issue that arises, I could say whatever Justin Trudeau states, the correct position is the opposite of that. So, I mean...
You know, I would be a bit of a hypocrite if I said, you know, I wouldn't listen to ideas from the other side. I do, and I've been known to change my mind once in a while. I think where we're in agreement 100%, though, is that, and I want to reemphasize this point, we're not talking about ideas, right? We're talking about his socks. And this is really like, you know, looking at the viewers, this is your job. It's really up to the Canadian public to stop making politics about celebrities and to start making politics about ideas. I mean, again, I hate the fact that, you know, I have to do the 140 character soundbite to have my voice in the political narrative, but the electorate will get from their politicians what they're demanding. And I know that people will be like, oh, Rempel, what are you saying? But there is a responsibility, as much as it's my responsibility to act with dignity and authenticity and do my job well, it's also the electorate's job to hold the government, you know, to account, to have some sort of policy, right? And that's where I hope that we move on from, like, yes, we have to assess whether or not Justin Trudeau and our leaders have the competency to achieve a vision. But when you don't have a policy vision and you don't have the competency, there's a big problem. And I hope that the next election is more along that vein than it is just about, like, you know.
I don't think it will be. I think regrettably it will be exactly the same thing as what happened when he was elected. But let's leave Justin Trudeau, because your point is well taken.
Thank you.
Let's get to specific issues that certainly keep me up at night. I think probably keep you up at night. Let's start with the first one, immigration. Now, you're sitting facing someone who is a product of the generosity of Canada, right? I escaped Lebanon with my family, and I am forever grateful to Canada for having given us a chance to come here. And so I am Canadian first, or a supporter of true Canadian values, more so than anyone else. So that's, I think, a good example of an immigrant, someone who comes here, who is cognizant of the opportunities that are afforded to them, who wants to work within the system, who wants to assimilate. So I don't need to be lectured by anybody about the importance of having a generous immigration policy. On the other hand, I've of course noticed over the past 15, 20 years or so that we've adopted a policy that borders on the suicidal. And before I offer any of my insights into this, because I've already done so on countless occasions, Salim Mansour, who is a professor at Western Ontario, University of Western Ontario, who is a practicing Muslim, and Tariq Fatah, who's another author and writer and journalist who is also a practicing Muslim, both have appeared in front of the government to say, hey, it might not be a great idea to have such an open border policy when it comes to people who don't necessarily share many of the foundational cultural values that define what it is to be Canadian. Let's talk about that. Now, it's difficult to argue that they are Islamophobic when they are, quote, brown men who are practicing Muslims, who take their religion very seriously, and they are warning us of this, as I am and others. So in your case, when you are operating within the halls of government and dealing with guys like Justin Trudeau, who's never met an Islamist that he hasn't found to be terribly charming and lovely, what do you think is going on? Is it that they don't recognize that there is a problem? Is it that they don't care that there is a problem? How do you see it?
Okay. You've given me so much to comment on, so indulge me.
Sure.
First of all, on the concept of immigration writ large in Canada, we have to start by acknowledging that Canada is a pluralism that has been built on the lands of First Nation and Indigenous people, right? So, since its inception, Canada has been working towards a pluralism, and it's never been easy and it's never been rosy, even though sometimes we paint our history that way. That pluralism has been something that has been very hard fought, right? And it continues to be. It's not something that comes naturally or easy. So what does that mean in terms of immigration policy? Immigration policy is all about how. It is 100% about how do you manage immigration in a pluralism. And broadly speaking, I think that you have to bring up the following facts. How do we match our immigration with the needs that our economy has, and be very realistic about economic immigration, like the changes that the Liberals have made, like, for example, to the weighting of whether or not you have a job to enter through the express entry program. How does that help match economic immigrants to the labor needs of Canada? And it's that how question that they can't answer, right? You've seen my exchanges with the immigration minister. And then furthermore, especially on the humanitarian immigration side, I think it was very dishonest of the Liberals to campaign in 2015 on a platform that 30,000 Syrian refugees would contribute to the economy in a very short period of time, because these people are coming from a war zone. They have trauma, and many of them do not have the exposure to the skills that you need to have in the Canadian economy. Bringing people to Canada as humanitarian immigrants requires an investment on behalf of the Canadian people. And if you don't have that process sorted out, that's where people start going, okay, well, this integration is not working, right? Again, it's that how do we integrate people into our pluralism? And it's through things like language acquisition, skills training, and exposure to an understanding that it is a responsibility for somebody coming to this country to uphold, not just practice our pluralism, but fiercely defend it. It's not just good enough to say, I believe in gender equality. It's actually about, preventing abuses in gender equality from happening within one's own community. And, so because we've now got this lack of thought or budget around integration for a large cohort of people, I think that that's problematic. I think that it's problematic that we are allowing people to come into the country and claim asylum through a loophole in an agreement, the illegal border crossing issue, because people who have entered the country legally look at that and go, that's not fair. And people who are in Canada go, why is this happening? And it's because that how isn't proper, that, you lose social license to, and I hate that term, but let's use it here. That's where you start getting this nativist, xenophobic sentiment. And, for me, government is most responsible for fomenting that, because they are not looking at how. I could rant at you for an hour on all of the ways that the government is failing in process. So to me, the way to combat what's happening with the government is to over and over and over and over show to the Canadian public that it is the Liberals' responsibility to fix the how if they're going to change the formula on how people enter the country. So for me, it's not a question of if, it's really a question of how. How many? How do we integrate? How do we ensure that people are accepting and upholding and defending our pluralism? How do we make sure that segments of the population aren't isolated, like new Canadian women aren't being ghettoized? I mean, these are all really tough questions, but at the same time, I think we also have to be very careful about painting any one group with a broad brush. I also think that at the same time, we can't shy away from talking about abuses when they do happen. So I know that that's an answer that will make nobody happy, but if you are coming into this debate with a very prescriptive, oversimplistic view on what's happening, that's where we fail in policy. But the fact that the government right now completely shies away from talking about this. Like, I mean, they didn't even want to talk about the Yazidi genocide. They didn't want to talk about female genital mutilation. That's not a big deal. It doesn't happen in Canada. Are you kidding me?
Because to talk about those crimes would be Islamophobic.
Right. I'm just gonna. Sorry.
You're frozen. Actually, you're.
I know. Sorry about that. Someone called. We're good now.
Yeah, we're good now.
Sorry, someone called through.
Okay.
So do you want to get into M103? Should we
Yeah,
talk about
let's do
this?
M103. I actually I gave a lecture. I mean, I didn't go to Toronto. There was a conference that was organized where, you know, many of the people that you might know that deal with this issue were asked to speak. I actually taped a lecture from Montreal and then sent it to them. And of course, given my personal history, I'm well versed to speak about the issue. But maybe you could tell us what's going on with it. I mean, I know it passed M103. Could it ever pass as a final sort of bill?
Okay. So we just spent a whole bunch of time talking about Canada's pluralism and how we defend it. One of the elements of Canada's pluralism is upholding the right to practice one's religion and to believe what one wants to believe, right? But having the right to believe something and having the right to practice a religion does not give one the unfettered ability to act on all of these beliefs. That's why we have laws, right? On how people behave. And it also doesn't give unfettered access to, or an unfettered ability for the Canadian public to question the validity of your beliefs, right?
It doesn't give the right, or it does give the right?
It doesn't.
Okay.
Because that's how our pluralism works is, you know, you can believe what you want, but I can question your belief.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I thought you were saying the opposite.
I think I can say I think you're crazy, and here's why. You don't have the right to you could argue and debate me, but you don't have the right to censor me. And I think that that's where a lot of Canadians have sort of reacted to the concept that was put forward in M103. I voted against the motion, because it was a motion, not a bill. I voted against it because when you look at the international definition, especially as put forward by the OIC, that it actually says, like, Islamophobia is defined as, I wish I had it in front of me, but it's essentially against Islam, right? So to me, I believe that everybody should have the ability to believe what they want and practice their faith in Canada. But you can't support anything that takes away someone or the government's ability to question that belief, right? So I mean, and like let's use an example in Christianity, right? What would have happened if the public or the Boston Globe didn't have the ability to examine the sex scandal within the Catholic Church? The same thing goes for the Islamic faith. I think that and you mentioned people who are Muslim who are questioning some of the practices, especially in theocratic countries like Iran, right? I mean, there are people like women that are questioning laws that are translated from their faith. And that's how religions and faith grows and becomes relevant over time. If you don't have that ability, you stagnate. And so, I think that if we shy away from talking about practices or issues that are associated with one faith without painting everybody with the same brush, because that's where we step into danger territory, we actually diminished Canada's pluralism. And that's why I think it was very important to vote against that bill. And also the government flat out rejected amendments to that bill, which would acknowledge the fact that there are many faith groups in Canada who are discriminated against. So rather than making it more universal, they made it more prescriptive, and they didn't address the issue that I just brought up. I raised this in the House of Commons, and that is a very simple question. Does the government believe that every parliamentarian and all Canadians should have the ability, the unfettered ability, to question how a faith and the translation of those beliefs affects humanity? And look, I have questioned many tenets of many faiths. But I mean, I like, what am I supposed to be silent on what's happening in Iran right now because it's a Muslim theocracy?
So what do you think?
I'm not going to do that.
What do you think explain? I mean, what you're saying to me at least seems very self-evident, right? So what is it? What is the disconnect between what you're saying, which should be banal in how obvious it is in a free society? I can criticize communism, I can criticize Jainism, or I can criticize Islam with equal alacrity. What is it in the liberal government's mindset that doesn't see what you're saying as self-evident? Is it that they are succumbing to sort of the identity politics of, but Muslims are a downtrodden minority, we need to provide them with a special protection beyond that afforded to everybody else? What's the disconnect between what you're saying, which to me is as clear as the existence of gravity, and why can't they see that?
Well, that's a question for them. They love it when we speculate about this, right? Because then they get to turn around and say, like, oh, look at them, they're racist and they've got a hidden agenda. That is a question for Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau should be able to accurately and articulately explain the answer to that question.
We're going to be waiting a long time for that answer, I think. If you're expecting him to be articulate, it's going to be a while.
The decision to not provide an answer is providing an answer in and of itself.
Right.
And it's now up to the Canadian electorate to hold the government to account for that lack of answer. And I mean, going back to the conversation around immigration and the upholding of our pluralism, that's a question that actually pretty neatly ties into that question. How do we protect Canada's pluralism? How do we have immigration and develop integration principles if we can't even have that discussion? So, I might sit down with someone who I fundamentally disagree with, who believes, somebody who vigorously will believe that I shouldn't have the same rights as a woman. I can have that conversation. But the fact is that, and I can say why that's not the case, but that conversation can happen. It just really has bothered me what a chill we've had on some of these tough conversations. And I think that in and of itself, like, people often ask, like, oh, well, why do you think there's all of these nationalist movements and stuff, which are frightening in a lot of ways. But I think that it's fermenting because we cannot, like, the debate is so polarized now, and we can't have these sort of pragmatic conversations. It really, so Justin Trudeau, why do you feel that way? That's a question. That's an answer for him. It really is.
Well, have him come on the show and I'll ask him. Sorry?
I refuse to answer for him on that question.
Right.
I just hope the Canadian public pushes him. Now, again, you've got the blood pressure up here.
You're talking about pluralism and diversity. Let me just mention my analysis of these two words. It's wonderful to be pluralistic and diverse when you're talking about linguistic diversity and skin color diversity and culinary diversity and pluralism. Right? There's endless ways by which the rich tapestry of human expression adds to our daily experience. But I don't want plurality and diversity when it comes to whether we should kill Jews or not. I don't want plurality, right? But you might agree. But I'm directing this at some of your colleagues who may or may not listen to this thing, right? So when you let in people in the thousands, where surveys have shown that 90, 95, 98% of them have rather harsh positions on gays, on clitorises, on Jews, on freedom of speech, then it doesn't take much of a statistician to say, well, it doesn't matter that individual people of that group might be lovely. And I certainly don't need to be lectured about that because I come from Lebanon. And I know that most people who come from those backgrounds are perfectly lovely. But it's a numbers game. If you let in 50,000 people, of which 95% hold very strongly anti-Semitic views, well, then I, as a Jewish person, have every reasonable right to worry about the downstream trajectory of our society. No?
Okay, so 2 points.
Okay.
Are there people in this country who enter the country who have beliefs, who hold beliefs that are, the opposite of what Canadian pluralism is? Yes. I think that we have to be very careful about throwing around statistics and things like that because it's equally damaging to paint a whole group with one brush. There'll be people who are angry with me for saying that, but we have to be careful with that, and I have to qualify your comment on that.
Okay.
That said, this is where Canadian law comes in. This is where political will and leadership and laws matter, okay? So this is where when someone beats the shit out of their wife, the book should be thrown at them, right? We have to understand. This is where I support mandatory minimum sentences for certain crimes, because there are certain things that as a society we have to very clearly say there's no qualification for this behavior. We can talk about rehabilitation and all of that sort of stuff, but you also have to put the rights of victims first. The minute you start thinking the other way, that's where you start getting warped ideas of what is acceptable behavior and what isn't. We can talk about how we as a society prevent breaches of our pluralism and prevent crime. That's through the development of laws, social programming, charity. We can talk about all of that, and we can talk about rehabilitation. But when it comes to somebody committing crimes that are associated with, religious belief, or just being violent, that happens in any segment of society.
Sure.
That's where laws come into place. And that's where, and again, point number 2, political leadership. And that's what I don't see in our prime minister.
Right.
Is I see a prime minister saying it is unacceptable for me to meet with somebody who fought with ISIS.
Right.
Let
alone opening the door with open arms. Sorry, go ahead.
It is unacceptable for me as the prime minister to tell the Canadian public that the first objective we have with people who went and fought with ISIS is to rehabilitate them. It is unacceptable for me as a prime minister to obfuscate on whether or not judges need an understanding of sexual assault awareness. The bill colleague Ronna Ambrose put forward is languishing in the Liberal majority Senate. To me, that's where when we go back to him not being serious, this is serious stuff. And there are certain things that you just have to do the right thing. And you know what? If there's some lefties that don't agree with you on it, you know what? Really, what is it? What is the right thing that we need to do for the Canadian public? He might fundamentally disagree with what I just said. He might. There are people who will watch this who will fundamentally disagree with what I just said. But then I want them and I want him to understand where that opinion might be detrimental to the Canadian public. You don't get to just sit on the fence on this stuff.
Sure.
So again, just going back, finishing my rant, we have to be very careful about how prescribing motive to one group of persons with bogus statistics. At the same time, we can't turn a blind eye when things do happen. We need strong laws and political leadership to fix it. And we need to have blunt public discourse without steering into the realm of racism.
Can I just make one small correction, if I may? The stats
Yes.
that I offered you are not bogus statistics; they're real
Okay.
statistics. You may
I
choose.
wasn't saying. I
Yeah,
just critical thinking,
got you,
questioning.
got you. No problem. Tell me about what you think. I don't know if you want to be a try to predict, but what's your mood regarding the 2019 election cycle? Are you feeling good? Are you feeling optimistic? Are you thinking Trudeau's going to lose? What's
I'm a fighter, right? So I am confident in, like, I am looking forward to the election from the perspective of having the discussion that we're having right here, but at a time when the public is really engaged on what they want for the future of the country. And I think, for all intents and purposes, we're going to be in that conversation starting in the fall, because we're maximum a year away at that point, right?
right?
Um, I will say this: a year and a half is a long time in politics. Anything can happen, right?
Right.
Uh, I think that the Prime Minister's office, I think the Liberal Party's machinery will be very worried about Justin Trudeau's brand right now, because they've hinged so much to it and it's taken a lot of beating, and he can't help himself. So if I was going to predict what's going to happen, I think that the Liberals are probably going to send him away from Ottawa quite a bit, because he gets beat up here all the time. I think that they're going to try and get him out into the community where he does better with photo ops, and he can be more of his charming self,
Right.
and where the media, gives him more favorable coverage. And because I think they're going to try and turn the narrative. I think they're going to throw a lot of goodies that we can't afford to try and buy people's votes in the next year. And I expect them to get a lot meaner with us. So going back to why do some of my colleagues not want to do this type of social media? Because it gives the opportunity for the Liberals to just dig you and poke you in the eye. I expect them to be a lot more dirty with their tactics over the next year. But I guess in terms of how do I feel, what's the mood, I'm optimistic that the Canadian people will give a really serious thought about what 2019 means. I mean, look, the 2015 election, my party didn't run a fantastic campaign. I think that there was a lot of questions about what we were standing for, and frankly, and just being blunt, a lot of people were questioning the leader of our party. I obviously stand behind him, Prime Minister, I think, fantastic leader. And Justin Trudeau kind of just rode that wave. I think a lot of people now are going, oh my goodness, what's happened? But Canadians also don't like to be wrong, right? And that's why Canadians typically give they give prime ministers 2 terms. That said, we've never seen a prime minister fail this spectacularly, right? And I think I'm optimistic that Canadians will start going, okay, if it's not this guy, then who? And that's where my party needs to make sure that we have a very strong platform that inspires Canadians to in terms of policy, but also in terms of leadership. And I've been pleased to see the leader of my party grow, Andrew Scheer, and he knows, I think, the weight of that responsibility especially when you contrast it to Justin Trudeau. It sits very heavily upon him. I know he takes it really seriously. So the next year and a half, that's what we're going to be focusing on, is contrasting our vision, building our vision out, and engaging the electorate. So
good luck.
I'm optimistic. I believe in Canadians. I do.
Last question, and then we could just chat very quickly offline after we end it. Anything that you'd like to promote, a cause, a book, a project, anything that you're working on that hasn't necessarily gone public that you'd like to use this platform to do so?
Oh my God, what do I pick? I'll start with the micro level issues. I've tabled a private members bill to close or to update the criminal code so that we actually have a bestiality law in Canada.
So right now it's okay to have sex with goats. It's not illegal.
Okay, are we going to talk about this?
Whatever you want.
There was a Supreme Court case where a man had, I'm just going to say it, he had, I think it was put peanut butter on his daughter's genitals and had his dog lick it off. So he was convicted of sexual assault, but he was not convicted of bestiality, because our bestiality law defines bestiality as penetration, where we know people do all sorts of weird things with animals that constitute sexual assault. So we need to close the loophole in the law. I can't believe I just talked about that, but there we are. There we have it. It's actually just a one-line change in the criminal code. We could probably pass it through the House as a unanimous consent. It could be law very quickly. The Liberals haven't done this, and I think this is a broader example, even though it's kind of disgusting and no one wants to talk about it. What has the Liberals done? What have they done in the justice file? So this is something I'd like to see. I'm advocating that the Prime Minister exercises or looks at his options in exercising different constitutional mechanisms to ensure that the pipeline in BC is built out, because I think people in Canada don't understand the environmental rigor that goes into both the build out of these projects and the maintenance and delivery of products, and also how important that is to the Canadian economy. I'm happy to talk to somebody about the transition to a green economy, but the reality is that the key word there is transition, and we utilize carbon products, and the debate on this is so crazy, but the Prime Minister can't abdicate his responsibility on this to the provinces. The budget was a disaster. If your viewers haven't followed this deficit spending debacle, I cannot believe that they spent so much to do so little. I don't know. I could give you a million different things. I guess I'll close with this. You asked me, what do I want to promote? I just want people to be more engaged in the political process. And that's more than just, following Twitter bots. It's having conversations like this, setting up petitions, following what's happening in legislation. I try and put out videos almost every day on what's happening in the House of Commons. I would love to see Canadians just really embrace, especially Canadians on the right who hold sort of, conservative viewpoints on how policy. I feel like that voice has been lost, and I think a lot of people in Canada fundamentally approach politics from that perspective, even though they might not label themselves as such. So get engaged, get involved, and bestiality.
Well, thank you for your openness, for your engagement, for your humility. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
I enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much. It's a real honor.
My pleasure. Stay on the line for a second. It should be up probably later today, if not tomorrow. Thank you so much, Michelle. Stay on the line.
Okay.